Okay. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Kyle. Yeah, I was also, it was kind of a amusing thing that happened because Kyle went to visit my, like he said, my ancestral plantation outside of New Orleans. It's called Destrehan Plantation. And he had such a powerful experience there. And I was really happy because the people who operated as a historical site, you know, apparently spent a lot of time with him and really let him see and hear about everything he was interested in, and there was a strong connection. So it gave me cause again to think about this aspect of my own life, my own history, my own family's history. Of course, basically as a white person growing up in New Orleans in Louisiana in the Deep South, growing up at the time I grew up, which again, how many of you here are taking the classes on American civil rights movement and civil rights laws? None of you familiar? Some of you? Yeah, so I was born in 1956, and this very important civil rights legislation was passed in 1964, and I was a kid when this stuff was unfolding. And literally unfolding in the neighborhood. And I would talk about this a little bit later in my presentation, but it was baffling to me and my family why anybody would oppose equal rights for anyone based on race. And of course, in Louisiana and most of the United States, that meant for blacks. And yet it was a very, very passionate and even violently held opposition, which divided the white community as well. So I grew up with that context, and always aware of, I know that's too much. I can't say I was always aware of my whiteness, but at some point became aware of my whiteness, aware of the life of blacks that I was in contact with either in the neighborhood or at school or at work. But it caused me to think a lot about it, and particularly about how my own family, my own community viewed and probably continues to view this history of plantations in the Deep South, which are considered to be kind of a peak of an admirable culture, a cultural period which ended with the Civil War. So Destrehan Plantation, this is the main house, and my family arrived from France in Louisiana around 1730. The forebear of the person who built this plantation. This plantation was completed around 1790. And, you know, at that time, I guess it may require some explanation. Lots of people came from Europe to the New World for different reasons, from different countries. Often they were people who were not well off, indentured servants, people who had debts to pay. Often they came for religious reasons, religious persecution. But there were, from most countries, also a sort of upper strata of very well-off people, even nobles, who were given land grants by their home governments, by their kings, for instance, in Europe, and were able to come and have a huge piece of property and become plantation owners, planters, and influential people. And that was the case of my family. There was a noble family, grew up in basically from Paris, and came in the early 18th century. Now, this is a map of New Orleans. New Orleans, the city, the old city, what's called the French Quarter, the Vieux Carré is here. This is all built up now. And this is the Mississippi River. Have any of you been to New Orleans? Yeah? Great. So you know the Mississippi River. And basically, all up and down the river, you can sort of see this sort of stripy pattern on either side of the river. These were all plantations. And from here by car, about an hour from here, you sort of go northwest, is the town of Baton Rouge. And there were over 400 plantations between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and there were about 20,000 slaves who were working those plantations. Now, this is actually a really nice map from a very good website called the German Coast, verylongroad.com. And the German Coast, this was the name given to this part of Louisiana along these parts of the river because there were also German immigrants. So you had a lot of French immigrants, you had Spanish as well, you had some Anglo-Saxons, and there were also Germans. It was called the German Coast. And the Destrehan Plantation occupied this big swatch here. And I don't know if I pointed, maybe I'll go back to the last slide again. This is over here. All of this is swamp, right? It's still swamp. I mean, they drain it and they make places for people to live, and that's one reason why New Orleans flooded so badly after Hurricane Katrina. But it's swamp, so the plantations have these very, very deep boundaries, some of them going all the way across to the lake, but this is swamp. It's not really able to be used for farming. But this was the Destrehan plantation. And this was, again, within the context of slavery in general in Louisiana. You know, you can't separate it from slavery in the New World altogether. There were slaves being brought from Africa, Western Africa, almost exclusively, to South America, to Brazil, to the Caribbean, to Cuba, as well as to North America. And different countries, depending on their policy, the Spanish policy regarding slaves was different from the French policy, was different from the English policy, was different from the Dutch policy. And Louisiana changed hands several times. The policies changed a bit, and the Louisiana slaveholding was a bit unique compared to other parts of the South for some reasons. But this map is also from a great website called radicalcartography.net, and it gives you actually a sort of time slider to show the change in demographics, the proportions of slaves. I don't know if it's clear to see here, but in 1860, there were almost 4 million slaves in the South. Here's the North, which is slave-free, so no slaves, and these show percentages. So from over here, it's like 15% in this sort of pink colors, 50% of this orange. The yellow is 95%. So you see, there's a lot of variation in the percentage of slaves in these regions, depending particularly on both the agricultural and the economic conditions. And what I want to point out here along the Mississippi River, this is northern Louisiana and up into Arkansas, it's close to 90%, 95%. There was a huge proportion of slaves in the population, and more so than the whites. And of course, as we know from other similar systems in the world, apartheid may be one where a white minority is governing a non-white majority. This was the situation, but of course it was slavery. And, you know, again, we should constantly reflect on this. It was legal. All of these things we're talking about were legal. This wasn't people breaking the law. This was legal, enshrined in legal codes. And in the case of Louisiana, there's something called the Code Noir, the Black Code, yeah, which was implemented, I guess, in the late 18th century. So this was the ancestor of mine, Jean-Noel Destrehan, who built the plantation. And he was let's say, an interesting guy, and the sort of person that, you know, my own family, my mother, aunts and uncles, grandparents, grandaunts and uncles, were all very, very proud of having had this ancestor. Among other things, of course, he was very wealthy. He had this big plantation. At the peak, the plantation had 200 slaves. He was involved in government. And was one of the people involved with the Louisiana Purchase. And at the manor house, the Destrehan Plantation House in New Orleans, there's a document signed by him as well as by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison relating to the Louisiana Purchase. So he was a very prominent person even in national government because of that. And there's other things as well. But I guess, you know, I remember things like stories my mother would say. Oh, yes, they were so wealthy. You know, he was so wealthy, if he dropped a silver dollar on the street, he wouldn't bend down to pick it up. He wouldn't stoop. You know, he's such a wealthy person. She would say it in the kind of way of, isn't that ridiculous? But kind of like she was proud of it, you know? And I remember going with my mother to visit this plantation, and I have to say, the historical presentation, and particularly regarding the lives of slaves, has improved immensely since the time I was a child, and partly through good funding and good historical work and good curation and very good docents. But these were not places that black people would go to take a tour when I was a kid. And again, that's changed a bit more, but people go to sort of recapture the glory of this past, and weren't we a wonderful society back then? And the history, the story of the blacks who lived and died there, and again, under very abusive conditions, although it's said that the Louisiana system, a so-called Creole slavery system, allowed more freedom, allowed economic independence. You know, it's said that it was better, but fundamentally it's based on abuse with no accountability, no repercussions to the white person who is abusing the black. And this was almost totally ignored. And again, it's better now. One interesting, an important thing that happened, this was in 1811, was a large slave revolt. About 1804, there was a successful slave revolt in Haiti. And New Orleans, because of its location on the Gulf of Mexico, was really economically closely tied to the Caribbean, almost more so than any other part, including Cuba, including Haiti and I would say Martinique. My own relatives also had spent time in Martinique. And many of these slaves became free in Haiti. Many moved to Louisiana. There was a large segment of population who were free men of color, who had been originally slaves in most cases and became free. And often they established a very strong economic presence as well, and sometimes political presence. But they came, and the stories got around, about this rebellion, and a slave from a plantation here in the place called La Place, a woodland plantation, a man named Charles Deslonde, he started to gather slaves, and it came to be about 200, and they went from plantation to plantation. They killed a lot of people. They were going to go all the way to New Orleans, to the city of New Orleans, and basically topple the government and take over, just like had happened in Haiti. They were stopped. They crossed Destrehan Plantation. Several of the slaves involved who were later executed were from Destrehan Plantation. But this ancestor, again, him, Charles Jean-Noel Destrehan, was one of the judges of the trial. And the trial was held on the porch, the veranda, of that house I showed the picture of, Destrehan Plantation. And about 30 of the slaves who were in the rebellion had died during the rebellion, and about 40 were sentenced to death at the tribunal and were executed, generally executed at the plantations where they had worked, where their owners lived, and they cut off their heads and they put them on pikes in front of the plantation. So there were just dozens of heads of executed slaves lining this road along the river from this part of the state to the city of New Orleans. And this is brutal by any standard. This is not something that would be done to executed white criminals, no matter what they had done. And these were basically people who simply were trying to be free. And again, this was all legal. It was considered justice. It was all legal. Apparently, a couple of dozen, about 20 slaves, did manage to escape and probably were never found. But it was a very, very brutal episode. So this is not something that my family ever really talked about, this role. And again, you could say, oh, what else could they do? It was a different era. You can use all of those justifications. But I want to point out, again, the legal system, this legal system that, put black slaves, and later, I think, Catherine will talk about more, I think, in terms of Jim Crow after the Civil War. Even people who had been freed blacks in places like Louisiana ultimately suffered discrimination, even though they had not been slaves before. It was kind of a horrific situation, but this was legal. It was a legal system. This is the first person with the name Azby Destrehan. He was born at the plantation, 1833, and lived there as a child. And then when he became adolescent, his father, New Orleans is a wild place. Those of you who have been there, it was always a wild place. It was very typical for these wealthy white people, the men, to gamble, lose their money, get hooked up with prostitutes and, all sorts of unsavory things. So he sent him away to school to Georgetown, outside of D.C. He spent most of his adolescence there, and among those documents, there's quite a lot of documents that my family had, which we donated to an archive in the city of New Orleans, are a lot of letters back and forth when he was in school. He had kind of a what would you call it, a person who took care of him, and a lot of letters about this. And this particular document is from a trip he took in the 1850s to Rome, and all of the things he bought, the artwork, statues, etc. So we had quite a lot of documentation about his daily life, but the main thing is he never came back to New Orleans. And then while he was in France, the Civil War broke out, and actually he died, 1862, I think. Yeah, 1862. So it was one phase, and the name Azby came because his father was playing with the alphabet. It's the first letter of the alphabet, the last, the second, and second to last. So it's actually a Kabbalistic cipher called the Atbash, which, if those of you who like cryptography will know that. So anyway, have you seen Gone with the Wind? Yeah, it's a historical piece. It's weird, isn't it? But when whites, when I was growing up, and I think even before, would think of plantations, this is what they thought. Oh, these wonderful gowns, these dresses, this wonderful period, and the lost cause of the Confederacy, these noble young men who fought, for their community, etc., and who lost, and isn't that a shame? And this is a very strong emotional appeal. And so, Destrehan Plantation is not really different. Almost every plantation when I was growing up, they would always have these balls, these southern balls, cotillions, time when you could dress up in these big antebellum dresses, and the men would often, the guys, even teenagers, would wear these Confederate uniforms and reenact this social thing. Of course, no blacks invited and no blacks included, and kind of totally eluding, kind of avoiding the actual deeper issues. This is Destrehan Plantation, a photo now. This is an oak tree called the Azby oak. I think it was planted when Azby Destrehan was born. And this is a wedding, and they have weddings there. And now I've had conversation about this with the people, and I know them very well, and I support a lot of what they do, and I'm very happy with most of the work that they do. And we talked about it because I was talking to a very influential black artist, American black artist named Dred Scott. And he chose the name based on the Dred Scott case. That's his artistic name, and he is actually planning a reenactment of that slave rebellion. His work is very, very closely focused on racism and those issues. And he's raised money. He did a wonderful Kickstarter to raise money for that, and he will reenact it. And we were talking. We were introduced by a museum person in New York, and we were talking, and I was explaining what I just explained to you. Oh, it's gotten much better in terms of how they're presenting the life of blacks, of the slaves. Now they talk about the slave rebellion, and you can go to the bookstore, and they have 30 volumes of what are called the slave narratives, which was a very important documentary project in the 1930s, basically, to get the narratives of every surviving slave they could find, to learn about their life, to hear about their life and record that. And he said, well, that's all well and good, but as far as I'm concerned, they don't have weddings at Auschwitz. And I laughed, and I thought, yeah, he's right. He's really right. And I posted that on Facebook. And a couple weeks later, I heard from one of the people who's supporting the plantation. He says, I heard you compared Destrehan to Auschwitz. He was really, really angry, really upset. I said, well, you should probably hear the whole story. He asked me to take it down. I didn't take it down. I just de-linked it from Destrehan Plantation. But I said, you should meet Dred Scott, because he's doing the slave rebellion reenactment, and this is a good moment for you to make contact with this person and see if there's a way you can support his project, because I think it's good for you and for everybody all together. So, and I talked to Dred, and he's kind of willing to do that. And I want to hear from him again. I contacted him the other day to say I'd be talking about this today. I didn't hear back from him yet, but it's a difficult thing. And my colleague who's working with the plantation, he said, well, how else are we going to keep open? Nobody can come to even hear about the slaves if we can't keep it open. And that's when we raise money, is by having these weddings. So it's a big problem. But, and I don't think it's been dealt with well. There's some very well-preserved slave cabins brought from another plantation. But Catherine and I were talking, our first conversation on Skype a couple of weeks ago. She's saying, yeah, they're kind of antiseptic probably. They don't convey the reality, the dirtiness of it, the real squalor that blacks were forced to live in, the slaves were forced to live in. On the other hand, there is another plantation in Louisiana, which was, let's say, remodeled, restored, and reopened. It's called Whitney Plantation, and this one focuses on the life of slaves. And among the things they have displayed are these iron jail cells, which came from a slave market. Basically, you go there and you really cannot escape the fact that, discipline was harsh. And again, it was abuse with no accountability at all. And Whitney Plantation is peopled with these life-size statues of slaves, children in particular. You can't escape that reality when you're there. And I'm going to just sort of jump forward. Again, so my family is sort of in this weird, ambiguous position. I think every white, let's just say in the South, in a place like Louisiana, is invested even unwillingly in the legacy of slavery. And we have been trained, we were taught, we were somehow conditioned, certainly my generation was, to think of this as a wonderful, positive thing to associate ourselves with, because it was beautiful. Look at those great dresses, fantastic architecture, et cetera, but not really addressing the underlying reality, and we're still dealing with it. And in the most painful way. It is, it's maddening, it's upsetting to me, it makes me sad that we still have not really dealt with it. In Louisiana, the population of blacks demographically had been the majority for quite a long time, 60% in New Orleans for quite a long time. And the white mayors, the white political establishment basically maintained the disenfranchisement of blacks as a matter of policy. And we'll hear about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was intended to change as much as possible, to desegregate, to make a legal basis to prevent people from excluding others on race, and this meant, again, blacks primarily. In the case of New Orleans, a key person was Moon Landrieu, who was elected mayor in 1970. And the Landrieux were from the same neighborhood. I went to school with their kids. I know Moon Landrieu, and when he was elected in 1960 to the state legislature, basically was the only white to support desegregation bills, was the only white to support these things. And he ran for mayor, got 99% of the black vote, 30-something% of the white vote. He became mayor and was a very successful mayor. And in the process, he ran on a platform, he said, I am going to enforce the Civil Rights Act. And that meant, for instance, making sure that blacks were represented in city government. And it went from, I don't know, some 10% or something of blacks in city government when he came into office to like 40%, 45%, by the time he left. And so this election and this campaign and his mayorship divided the white community. People like my family who supported this, and I was telling Catherine earlier, it gave us a political movement we could get behind, a political representative that we could get behind and support in order to support goals that we thought were necessary. But he was very unpopular with a lot of whites, just like the Civil Rights Act was. I'm going over time a bit, I think, but interestingly, after he left office in 1978, there was a string of black mayors. He basically paved the way for black political leadership in the city. And there was not another white mayor until his son, Mitch, and the date's kind of messed up, but he was elected in 2010 and left office last year. His son, Mitch, who again went to high school, he was in my brother's class, we all hung out together, he was elected. And basically continuing that legacy. And among the legacies is what to do with statues of Confederate generals that are all over the South in every city, which came to a head, as you know, within the last 2 years. And he started hearings and recommended a bill to be passed to have them removed. And the hearings were held. The city government, the representatives all voted on it, and they agreed. And they were basically removed 2 years ago. And again, this was the occasion of a lot. I mean, the eruption of, again, the worst kind of racial animus from whites who were feeling somehow, I mean, they're arguing that this is our history, this is our, you know, whatever, our culture, our heritage that you're removing, but not wanting to face what it means to be, as Mitch put it very eloquently, to be a black child looking up at these statues and saying, what does that mean for me? How can I be part of this? So again, in a city that is 60% black. So the fight is still going on. And I was, again, telling Catherine a little while earlier, you know, I thought a lot of these problems were, if not solved, were on the way to being solved, that we had dealt with it, that there was some consensus. And at the same time, I know that within white communities, the way whites in New Orleans, for instance, even own relatives, or if I go to my friend's house, the way they talk amongst each other when blacks aren't around is very different. Racial epithets, N-word goes very freely. And again, I'm not going to say not everybody, but it's so common that we hardly blink. Yeah, okay, that's them. But, you know, there's no social penalty in most cases for them to do that. Certainly no economic penalty and very little political penalty. So I think that's where we are. And it comes down to me, I tell people that if they want to understand how a white Southerner at this point can reinforce, can wave this Confederate flag. And again, Moon Landry was the one who had that flag removed from the State House and the government buildings in New Orleans and Louisiana. How could they do that? I said, you have to think like a 10-year-old boy who is sort of emotionally stuck at that level of, you know, who we are, woo-ha, you know, we're rebels, huh. It's this emotional bond to this a certain sense of identity that has been instilled over generations and generations that is not an inclusive one. It's based on exclusion and this institutional exclusion that has gone on for centuries in my own hometown, in my own home region. So that's where I'm going to stop. And you ready?
Okay. So hello, everyone. I was trying to get the guys to not make me use a microphone because I'm pretty loud. So, okay. So, how many people know what a Jim Crow law is? Who's heard of that term? You got to put it up higher. Okay. All right. A lot of you. That's awesome. So what Azby did was Azby talked about the South and slavery, and probably as early as 1619 to the mid 1800s. That was sort of the area, the era, genre, the time that he was talking about. I'm going to pick it up after that, okay? But before I do, I would like to ask you, please, to stand up. You, and you. Up higher, there you go. So I want to say this, and I know it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but I was watching, you know, I spent a lot of time watching the students and you know, all of the participants, and this is going to sound weird, but it's not my impression that you're engaged. And so what I'm thinking is, maybe for a better quality of presentation, this is not really where you want to be right now. So I'm going to ask you to take your stuff and leave. Right. I need everybody to look at her face. If you could just make that expression one more time, right? Okay, so have a seat. So obviously I don't feel that way. That's not me, and that's not what I'm, but there are very few ways to get people to understand what it feels like to be excluded, what it feels like viscerally to be excluded for something that you have no control over, okay? So I'm going to talk about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws thrived in the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. That sounds like in the past, right? In the past. But it's not. It's not. So I want you to look at this up here. Because you corrupt public morals, we can't have you participate as you are. That is an actual quote. That was a quote, a statement that an educator made to a student. Now, just out of curiosity, when do you think that happened? When do you think this kind of thinking was permitted in the educational system? Any ideas? Oh, come on, you know you have. The what?
70s?
The 70s?
70s?
Like 1970s? And who said the 60s? The 1960s?
I'm going to be the cynic and say that this was pretty recently, maybe like 5 years ago.
Ooh. Do I have news for you? All right. November 17th, 2017. Here. Here. Okay, so a Jim Crow law is a law that legalizes segregation. I'm using the mic. That legalizes segregation, okay? It excludes people based on their features, not the caliber of their character, not their intellect, but on their features. Because the thinking is certain people corrupt a separate group. And we think about that stuff as in the late 1800s through mid 1900s. This is November 17th, 2017. We think about this stuff as the American history of hate and racism, right? This is Osaka Prefecture. This story is a story about a young girl. She was 17. She was, I think, in her 3rd year of high school. She was told by her educators that she was not permitted to return to school because, who knows the story? Because her hair is black, or her hair is brown, I'm sorry. Her natural hair, the hair that she was born with, the hair, you know, pick who you, it's Allah, Jesus, somebody gave this child this hair, right? And her educator said, because her hair is brown, not black, she cannot return to school until she dyes her hair. Legalized segregation. And they kept at this child and at this child and at this child until she finally dyed her hair black so that she wasn't kicked out of school. So I'm going to talk about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws legalize that experience. But there are 2 things I want you to keep in mind, okay? I'm going to talk about it in the context of American history of racism. But I want you to keep in mind this. 1, it's not just crazy America. I mean, we're crazy. But it's not just American non-exceptionalism. 1. And 2, it's not in our past. Azby talked about slavery. He talked about his family plantation. He talked about rebellions and ancestors. And we like to think of that experience as historical, right? We like to think of it as in the past. We've evolved. We're more powerful. We're more articulate. We're more diverse. November 17th. 2017. Don't come back to school because your hair is brown. Okay? So just keep that in mind. It's not in the past. I love this quote. Martin Luther King in 1965 did a speech at UCLA. And one of the things I love about this quote is that we look at laws and we say, we want our laws to protect us. We want to bring equality into our daily interaction, right? But Martin Luther King looked at laws and he said, look, It may be true that a law will never make you love me, but it will make you stop lynching me. And I think that's kind of important, all right? So keep this notion in mind, because laws have done a couple of things. We're going to talk about laws that have disenfranchised people, and we're going to talk a little bit about laws that have pulled people back into the fold, right? But it's never the purpose of the law to tell us how to interact, just to put limits on our behavior. Okay, so hearts and minds. 1865, and this sort of picks up where Azby left off. 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. How many people think slavery is illegal in the United States? Raise your hand. Ooh, you want to raise your hand, but you know it's a trick question, don't you? How many people, go ahead, put it up there, think slavery is illegal in the United States? It's not. I know. I do this to my class all the time. They hate me. But neither slavery nor slavery is permitted except as punishment for a crime where the party has been duly tried and convicted. Okay? In 1865, our forefathers in the United States amended the Constitution to make, slavery illegal, right? They were trying to do this. I'm not trying to make man love you, but I really would rather him stop from lynching me, and that's pretty important. That's what the 13th Amendment was about. So it was passed in 1865 that made slavery illegal except in certain situations. And that's going to be important as we progress. So, you saw Azby's chart about where slavery was primarily focused in the United States, primarily the southern states, right? There were slaves in the north. And here's a little fun fact. How many people know that blacks participated in the vote to ratify the Constitution? It's true. That was just a fun fact. That's not my lecture. It's just a little extra. But, okay, so once the 13th Amendment was passed, the South rebelled. Now, I always like to talk to my students about this part. Think about it. So Southerners had all this free labor. Someone took the labor from them and said, oh, also they're equal. Like the 14th Amendment, we're all citizens. The 15th Amendment, we can all vote, right? The South handled none of that well, none of it. And in fact, there were 13 states in the South that refused to join the Union. That's what the Civil War is about. So once the 13th Amendment was passed, this is a quote from Dr. Carol Anderson in a book called White Rage. One of the then president's emissaries, and she's talking about after the 13th Amendment was passed, Carl Schurz recoiled as he traveled throughout the South and gathered reports of black women who'd been scalped, had their ears cut off, or had been thrown into a river and drowned amid chants for them to swim to those damn Yankees. Young black boys and men were routinely stabbed, clubbed, and shot. Some were even chained to a tree and burned to death in what can only be described as a travelogue of death. As he went from county to county, state to state, he conveyed the sickening, unbearable stench of decomposing black bodies hanging from limbs, rotting in ditches, and clogging the roadways. It gets me every time. But this was the South's response to abolishing slavery. There was a lot of rage and hostility about it. I try hard not to judge. That's not true, I judge all the time. But so I do try to bring a little bit of balance into these conversations. And some of the balance I like to bring is this was the way of life that they knew and understood, only having slaves. And so when someone told them, not only could they not have slaves, they were really bad people for having them, they didn't react very well. I'll just leave it there. And so their response to that was, okay, we've abolished slavery, but we're going to create some laws that will capture the relationships that we had when slavery existed. Those are Jim Crow laws. Okay? And so those laws were primarily in place from, I'd like to say 1865, but it's probably closer to 1870, to as far forward as the mid to late 1900s. In fact, technically, there are still Jim Crow laws on the books now. They're unconstitutional, they can't be enforced, but they were never removed. But a Jim Crow, so how many people know that Jim Crow is not a person? Right? Jim Crow is not a person. So you're gonna be able to like charm everybody on trivia night. Jim Crow is not a person. Jim Crow was a concept. There was actually a person that did this black caricature that was referred to as Jim Crow. White guy, blackface, right? He played this really ignorant, you know, dumb, like stupid, crazy black guy, blackface. He called himself Jim Crow. So a lot of people think that these laws were based on that character. Nobody knows, that's just a theory. But in any event, a Jim Crow law, those were laws that enforced racial segregation primarily, but not exclusively, in the South. Okay? They reestablished the race relationships that the 13th Amendment threatened. So the 13th Amendment freed all the slaves. But think about what was going on during slavery. It just wasn't free labor. You had people that you thought of as animals. Not to put too fine a point on it, and Azby and I talked about this a little bit, but we talk about slavery like it was just about forced labor. It wasn't. Slaves were bred like dogs are bred, but dogs were treated better, right? Slave babies were taken and used for, I don't know, alligator hunting, and I didn't just make that up, okay? Slavery wasn't just about free labor. It really had a whole lot more going on. Well, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the question was, what do we do with those relationships? Because we don't want blacks, you know, we don't want slaves commingling with whites. So how do we make sure that never happens? Those are Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were written and designed to make sure that even if you say slavery is illegal, I still don't have to like you. Okay, that's what they are. So, it was legalized discrimination. There was no part of our society where Jim Crow laws didn't reach, none. Adoption, military, medical care, prisons, right? Parks, baseball, like seriously, baseball, playgrounds, fishing, boating, buying alcohol, funerals, dining, hygiene, lodging, circuses. There are literally laws on the books that said blacks and whites cannot commingle when they're doing these things. Because while slavery was illegal, there was no one who was going to force primarily Southerners to interact with what they considered as mongrels. Okay? So these laws were written. Let me give you a few examples. Just a small sampling. Books shall not be interchangeable between the white and colored schools, but shall continue to be used by the race first using them. So if I'm black and I touch the book first, the book is forever black. Okay? Building permits for building Negro houses in white communities or any portion of the community inhabited principally by white people and vice versa is prohibited. This is a crime. Penalty, $50 to $2,000, and the municipality shall have the right to cause said building to be removed and destroyed. All marriages between a white and a Negro, between a white person and a person of Negro descent to the fourth generation inclusive, are hereby forever prohibited. So what that means is, so this is you, These are your parents. These are your parents' parents. Now we're at 8. These are your parents' parents' parents. We're at 16. None of those, if anybody in that chain is black, no one in that chain can marry someone white. Okay? 4th generation inclusive are forever prohibited. That's Florida. Negro porters shall not sleep in sleeping car berths, nor use bedding intended for white passengers. The officer in charge shall, now this is a funeral home, shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored person upon ground set apart or used for the burial of white persons. No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls, which I always find is interesting. So black barbers can cut white dudes' hair, but just not touch women, okay? So think about what that was meant to protect. In no event shall a Negro be eligible to participate in a Democratic Party primary election held in the state of Texas. Texas wasn't even scared. Texas put their state right in that law. They wanted it very clear, no voting, all right? Which is interesting because I have an example about Texas today. And it shall be unlawful for a Negro or white person to play together or in the company with each other at any game of pool or billiards. Truth be told, I only include that one because I think it's funny. Like, what, do the pool balls have cooties? Like, what's the deal? What are we really trying to protect here? But the point is that these laws, these Jim Crow laws, were written to enforce a mentality that some people are better than others. So this is going to take me back to my first question. When I had you stand up, I had you stand up, and I had you stand up, and I had, like I was literally watching, okay? How did you feel when I said to you, based on factions you don't know about, you're excluded? Like, what'd you make that face for?
I came all this way.
All this way to hear this brilliance, right? Embarrassing? Was it uncomfortable for anyone? Oh, yeah? Why? How?
I don't know, I was kind of shook because especially for me, I was paying quite a lot of attention and then all of a sudden you called me out and I was like, wait,
Whoa.
what? No, that's,
Right?
that's not fair.
Yes, don't pick on me, I'm great, right? So think about this. So the example I gave you was November 17, 2017. I will just tell you that I could literally name at least 7 cases today where a black child was sent home because their natural hair isn't in keeping with what a school finds as appropriate. So when you think about, for those of you who had to stand up, when you think about being called out like that, it's horrifically embarrassing. It's horrifically embarrassing. Everybody sees it. But that's just them. What about the rest of you who were like, thank God she didn't call me, right? Thank God I didn't call you. So now I'm sending you a message that they're less than and you're not. All right? So when you think about this small sampling of Jim Crow laws, remember that's the message. The message wasn't, do we really care about, you know, pool cues and balls and tables? The message is you're inferior. Someone's inferior and someone's superior. And that's what those laws were designed to protect. So here are some examples. North Carolina, so we all know about this, right? We all know about having people sit in the back of the bus. These are placards that were actually put on chairs, bench seats on buses to make sure blacks knew they had to sit in the back. And this is a picture of that. I'm gonna tell you, this is me being just a tiny bit petty, a little bit, but why is she so mad? She's all the way in the front. But all these blacks are in the back because that's the only place that they're permitted to sit, okay? That's very common during the Jim Crow era, and that was in the 1960s. This gentleman is a doctor, that's his family. He's traveling, he's in New Mexico, 1955. And there are places he can go and places he can't. He looks like a decent guy to me, but he can't go in certain places because of how he looks. Not what he's done, but how he looks. This is a kid, he's 19 years old. Like 19 years old. He goes to one of the city's segregated pools. I apologize, I don't recall which city. But once he went to the pool, the city closed the pool. Closed it. Okay, so here's a little personal anecdote for me, and I always tell my class these stories. But when I was 12, and I'm really only like 25 now, so it wasn't that long ago. But when I was 12, so I went to visit my grandmother in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I went, and my brother and 2 cousins went, and we were all California kids, like California. It's weird, right? Who said that? Okay, woo! And so we would go every day to her office. She worked at the NAACP. She was the vice president for the NAACP. We'd go to her office every day. And across the street from her office was this little city pool. So one day, we all decided to get our bathing suits. And we didn't tell Grandma, because somehow we knew Grandma would say no. She's kind of mean. And so we got our swimsuits, and we gathered them all up. And when it was time for lunch, we just carried our little happy butts across the street, because we were going to swim. And we got to the gate, and we were like, okay, well, we want to swim. And the guy at the gate was like, well, no, you can't come in here. We were like, but they're swimming. And the guy was like, this pool isn't for you. I swear to God, hand to God, I truly thought the man was telling me the pool was closed. Because as a kid from California, I didn't have these kind of racial experiences. But when I'd gone to the South, there was no swimming in the pool with white kids, right? None. And to be honest, none of us realized what the guy was saying to us. But my grandmother from across the street saw us all arguing with the man. So not only were we not like Southern black, so I had not learned the deference, and we were going to debate this till the end, right? I didn't feel like I had to yield if I knew I was right. My grandmother came flying across the street. She snatched every one of us up and drug us back and it was her, my grandmother was the one that told us we couldn't swim there because black kids can't swim with white kids. Okay? So I was 12. This kid had a whole pool closed because of him. The whole pool. Can you just imagine how horrific that has to feel? And I say these stories because this was 1958. I was 12 in 1980. That is not that long ago. Okay, I did just tell all of you how old I am, but that's not important. The important part is that's not forever ago, right? November 17th, 2017. Here's another example. Azby, I told you I would touch back on this, how whites would decide at some point we're not going to do the racist. We're really going to say segregation is what we want to do. This guy here, he was a freedom rider. He fought against segregationists. And he was beaten, and white ambulances refused to treat him because he thought blacks and whites should mix. That's on the left side. On the right side, this guy is a former cop, and he's kicking this guy down here because he's sitting at a lunch counter, right? Waiting to be served. This is life under Jim Crow law. Now, that was then, right? That was then. This is now. Hey, how many of you have seen Lion King? The cartoon. Get him up there. I can't really see. So do you remember when Rafiki hit Simba in the head, and Simba's like, "Ow, what'd you do that for?" And Rafiki said, "It doesn't matter. It's in the past," right? we think of Jim Crow laws like that. We do. We think of Jim Crow laws. It's in the past. It doesn't matter. It's in the past. But is it? But is it? Are we living with its vestiges today? I don't know. Let's look and see. I know this is 1963. I know this is the same group, well, at least they have the same name, in 2017. Okay, and this was a group in North Carolina. How many people, was it North Carolina? Where the guy ran over the girl? Charlottesville, okay. That's this group. Where there was a protest, and I think one group, and correct me if I'm wrong, one group was protesting Confederate statues, right? And the other group was white nationalists. This is the one where the president came in and said, oh, there were good people on both sides? Okay. And then one of the white nationalists backed up or drove forward and ran over one of the, I'm not even sure what the other group called itself, but and killed her, killed a little girl. Anyway, so that's this group. All of the identical paraphernalia, all of the identical paraphernalia. So is it in the past? That was then, right? So it will take decades and decades to disassociate ourselves from the cost of racism and segregation. We are not done. We're not even close. Jim Crow laws are off the books, meaning they are now unconstitutional. But the practice, exclusion, hierarchical relationships continue. Let me just show you how, right? I've already told you about this November 17th incident. That was here in Japan. In the United States, as I said, I've had at least six cases in the last 6 months, 7 months, where children have been sent home because their hair doesn't meet school standards. Okay, fine, that's fair, right? We want kids to not be distracted. We want kids to go to school for education. But these children, one little boy had an afro, and that's it. He didn't have a messy afro, he just had an afro. One little girl had braids, right? One little girl had braids in her hair. She was sent home. One little boy, he was a Native American boy, and he had his hair naturally uncut. It just hung down the way he was born with it, right? So case after case, kids are being sent home because someone is saying to them, who you are, what you look like, I find distracting, offensive, and non-inclusive. So if you could just get yourself together and come back a little whiter, that'd be great. Okay? Now I want to say this, and I always say this to my class, and you know, I probably shouldn't, but do you think anyone would send me home with my hair looking as it does? No, no one would. It would not even occur to anyone to send me home. They sent the little girl with braids home because they said, no extensions allowed. Listen, child, this is not my hair. Okay, I was not born blonde. I was born beautiful, but not blonde, right? And so the message that I would understand instantly is not whether the hair is natural, it's whether the hair looks like you. And that's what those children understood too. They were not European looking enough. So when we think about Jim Crow laws, we think about they happened in the 1800s, and that was then, and kumbaya. Woo! We're nowhere close to being past that. So in education and employment, we have hair, for example, voting. Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, North Carolina, the 2018 elections. You remember the Jim Crow law I showed you that said the state of Texas will not allow people to participate in their voting process? Those states didn't either. There's a case called, we haven't done voting yet, have we? North Carolina v. Holder. North Carolina NAACP v. McCrory, not Holder, McCrory. And in that case, the state of North Carolina asked the Department of Motor Vehicles to give us all, because you know when you go to get your license, you can register to vote in the United States. They said, give me all the data about your voters. I like these variables: race, age, whether they vote early, right? And they said, and they took those variables, and they said, what type of ID do people of color use? They took those variables one by one. They cut those voters out of the electorate. What do I mean by that? If you voted using an expired ID, and you were under 70, you couldn't vote in North Carolina. If you were over 70, you could. Why? Because the data in North Carolina showed that if you're under 70 with an expired ID, you're more likely to be black. If you're over 70, you're more likely to be old and white. They did step by step, excluded people of color from the voting process. It was so clear and so obvious that the Fifth Circuit said to North Carolina, you excluded blacks with surgical precision, right? So this law is unconstitutional. So that was in 2012. So we are not far away from that. Housing, we still are seeing this sort of Jim Crow progeny, meaning the Constitution doesn't permit anyone to say, oh yeah, we don't allow blacks. Constitution doesn't permit it. So it does it different ways. People do it different ways. They say, we don't like your hair, right? We don't want you to vote. In housing, it shows up like if you apply for an apartment, we're gonna put special stuff on your application so we know the color of the person that's applying. How many people know one of the more famous cases for that? Ma'am? I am, you're the winner. Say it again.
Trump had his own apartments where he did not allow black people to move in.
Donald Trump, our president. He and his father owned a lot of property in New York, and what they would do is they would put identifiers on applications. And so when the person that had a C for colored on their application, see, she's in my class. I'm totally ruining all of my spiel right now. But when a person who was black applied, it was understood that they were black. And so the manager would contact that person and say there's no apartment available, or that there's double the deposit, okay? Or that we don't accept kids, right? That was a very common practice. He was sued for it by the Department of Justice. And they reached a settlement agreement where those practices would change. But that was common. Policing, don't even get me started, right? Jim Crow laws are unconstitutional. The mentality has yet to be controlled. But, and I always say this, I do, I believe this in my gut. Take heart, right? We have, as a nation, the United States has permitted this mentality about blacks and slaves since 1619. It was 400 years. 400 years. We have only been about this equality thing for about 54. We're new to it, and we're really not doing that bad. 55 years out of 400. We are far from perfect. But we're like tweens. Wait, is that what you call 12-year-olds? Okay, we're them. We're like tweens. We're new at this. We'll get better. We have a long way to go. It's not in our past. It's real. Thank you for your time.